This is Wednesday, the 29th of September 2021. Welcome to IQI, or Inconvenient Questions International, on Clubhouse. I'm your host, Vishwa Sadashivan from Singapore. IQ is committed to fostering deeper understanding, empathy, and involvement through meaningful, informed conversations across boundaries. We want to hear from people who are directly involved. Today, we talk about a smoldering issue that has become full-blown in the past few weeks. It is an issue that may appear remote and removed from our own realities, but it is closer to home than we actually imagine. It is an issue that should be of concern to us because it's at the core of human rights, of dignity, and indeed of our survival. Today's topic is understanding Afghanistan. Why understanding? It's because if we don't know the history, the psyche, and realities of this ancient civilization, we could end up doing a lot more harm in wanting to help. Graveyard of empires is how Afghanistan is often described. Why? Because in its over 3,500-year history, it's been invaded by so many empires: the Mongols, Muslim Arabs, the Mauryas, Alexander the Great of Macedonia, and more recently the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the USA. The Afghans, though divided, are a fiercely proud people. Not one foreign power could stick its flag in Afghan soil for long. Even where the intentions are noble, the outcome was humiliation. Buddhism and Zoroastrianism were dominant religions until the Arabs brought Islam to Afghanistan around the year 600. Today, Afghanistan has an estimated population of 38 million, of which 99.7% are Muslim. Kabul is the capital with 4.2 million people. The GDP in nominal terms is about $20 billion. It's estimated to have Afghanistan is estimated to have $1 trillion worth of untapped reserves in minerals and precious stones. This is clearly of pecuniary interest to outsiders, especially big powers. Landlocked Afghanistan is of strategic significance to major powers. Not only was it a key node in the Silk Road, it is also a buffer state for Iran to the west, Russia to the northwest, Central Asia to the north, China to the northeast, Pakistan to the east, and India to the southeast. In early September 2021, just recently, China said that it's ready for, quote, friendly and cooperative relations, unquote, with the new Taliban regime, especially with investments from the Belt Initiative, or BRI. It is this strategic positioning that made Afghanistan a place of interest for three powers over the past 180 years. From 1838, Britain, looking to protect its Indian empire from Russia, attempted to annex Afghanistan. This resulted in three British-Afghan wars. Beleaguered in the wake of World War II, the British were defeated in the Third British-Afghan War from 1919 to 1921. Afghanistan became an independent nation. In 1965, fast forward, the Afghan Communist Party secretly forms. In 1978, there is a communist coup in Afghanistan, and Nur Muhammad Taraki becomes president and signs a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. Now, meanwhile, conservative Islamic and ethnic leaders who objected to social changes began an armed revolt in the countryside. In the same year, a guerrilla movement to battle the Soviet-backed government is formed, the Mujahideen. Upon the assassination in 1979 of its ally and comrade, President Taraki, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan on the 24th of December, that is 1979, to bolster the faltering communist regime. Babra Karmal is emplaced as prime minister. Widespread opposition to Karmal and the Soviets spawns violent public demonstrations. Soon after, the Mujahideen start receiving arms from the United States, from Britain and China via Pakistan to fight the Soviet forces. In September of 1988, and this is important, Osama bin Laden, a Saudi in exile, and 15 other Islamists form the group Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to continue their jihad or holy war against the Soviets and others who they say oppose their goal of a pure nation governed by Islam. In 1989, the US, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union signed peace accords in Geneva guaranteeing Afghan independence and the withdrawal of 100,000 Soviet troops. This was in 1989. Almost a decade down, in 1996, a newly formed Islamic militia, the Taliban, rises to power. They rule for the next 5 years. What's little known is that at that time, most Afghans, exhausted by years of drought, famine, and war, approve of the Taliban for upholding traditional Islamic values. The Taliban outlawed cultivation of poppies for opium trade, cracked down on crime, and curtailed the education and employment of women. Women were required to be fully veiled and not allowed outside alone. Islamic law was enforced via public executions and amputations. The United States refused to recognize the authority of the Taliban. Then, on the 11th of September 2001, the world witnessed commercial planes crashing into the World Trade Center towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing nearly 3,000 people. Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda are prime suspects. Less than a month later, following unanswered demands that the Taliban turn over Osama bin Laden, US and British forces launched airstrikes against targets in Afghanistan. The Taliban are defeated on the 22nd of December 2001, just a couple of months later, and Hamid Karzai is sworn in as the leader of the interim government in Afghanistan. A new constitution is adopted following inputs from nearly 500,000 Afghans. Among other things, it calls for equality for women. In 2005, the nation holds its first parliamentary elections in more than 30 years. It was peaceful. The international community pledges more than $15 billion in aid to Afghanistan at a donors conference in Paris. US President Barack Obama dispatches more military and civilian trainers to the country, in addition to the 17,000 more combat troops he previously ordered to Afghanistan. In 2011, 10 years after 9/11 attacks, US forces killed Osama bin Laden in his hideout in Pakistan. In May of 2014, President Obama announces a timeline for significantly reducing US troop deployment in Afghanistan by 2016, only to abandon the plan the following year. When he left office in 2017, there were 5,500 US troops in Afghanistan. In February of 2019, the USA, under President Trump, and the Taliban signed an agreement on a peace deal which included full US troop withdrawal by May of 2021. In November of 2020, days before Biden was inaugurated, President Trump reduced the troop size from 5,500 to 2,500. In April of 2021, President Biden announced his aim to have a complete US withdrawal by the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on American soil. On the 15th of August 2021, the Afghanistan and the government collapses as the Taliban takes over Kabul. The following week, 2 suicide bombings occur outside the Kabul airport as thousands of Afghans try to flee the country. The bombings killed 169 Afghans and 13 US troops. The extremist group ISIS claimed responsibility. This was the deadliest day for American troops in the country since 2011. And on the 30th of August 2021, the US transports a final contingent of troops from Kabul airport, officially ending America's longest war. So here are some big questions. Why did the US stay on for 20 years in Afghanistan when they accomplished the mission to defeat the Taliban in 2 months? Did the British, Soviet Union, and USA cause more harm than good in invading Afghanistan, to themselves as well as to the Afghans? Number 3, did Presidents Trump and Biden do the right thing by pulling out US troops from Afghanistan? Could this have been managed better, perhaps? Some argue, isn't it time for the Afghans to take charge and sort out their own issues? Number 4, the Taliban are given assurances today that women will be treated, are giving assurances today that women are being treated humanely and are being allowed to seek education. Now, how sincere are they? My final question is there a role for the United Nations and the international community to help ensure basic human rights in Afghanistan? Is there a role for the international community? To help us have a more meaningful, informed discussion, we have a panel of 4 speakers. Dr. Shanthie Mariet D'Souza, founding professor, Kautilya School of Public Policy in India. Now, Shanthie spent a decade in Afghanistan. Next, we have Chandran Nair, who is founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, based in Hong Kong. Sveto Muhammad Ishoq. Sveto Muhammad Ishoq, also called Sweta, an Afghan women's rights advocate, an activist, and a social entrepreneur. And last but certainly not least, on the main panel, we have Micah Petersen, a captain with the US Army who also served in Afghanistan. IQ International is committed to ensuring that the voices of youths from around the world are heard in each discussion. We have an international panel of 3 young people raring to share their perspectives, their hopes, and to raise questions. Abdul Wasif Waqif, an Afghan formerly from the Education Ministry and currently a master's student in Singapore. Chayanika Saxena, a PhD student from India researching on Afghanistan. Louis Martin Vezien, a student with the University of London and a geopolitics blogger on CI Geography. For today's discussion, I have the pleasure of having Dr. H.C. Aziza Jalaluddin as my co-moderator. Aziza is founder and chief mentor of Go Global Business School. So let me kick off this discussion with a question for my 4 panel speakers. And this is a question. What is a key lesson we have learned in the past 40 years of war in Afghanistan? In no more than 3 minutes each, please. Who'd like to go first? Perhaps we can hear from you, Chandran.
Yeah, so just a reset of the room, Mr. Viswa. So just for the panels who are new to the stage, you may want to unmute yourself by pressing on the mic on the right and bottom of the, yes, that's right. That's how you do it. So Ms. Sweta, maybe you want to go ahead first.
Thank you so much, Ms. Aziza, and thank you for having me in this very important and very timely discussion. There are many points that I would like to mention. First, I think as an Afghan youth, I would like to say that one of the things that we did, or like one of the lessons that I personally learned, is that we have to know the leaders of our country, and we have to choose them very wisely, because in the past we made a lot of mistakes in terms of choosing and voting for the leaders who basically betrayed us, betrayed the nation, and I think a lot of Afghan youth would agree with me on that issue. And in terms of the other lesson that I feel that in terms of the world, what the lesson that we can say to the world is that please do not go to the countries that you have no idea about, that you don't have much information about its complexities, about its cultural complexities, because Afghanistan has a long history and it is very complex, and it is not very easy and very straightforward to just enter that country and implement your foreign policy strategy. It might not work there, and as if it would work in some other countries. So I think that is something like a lesson that the world should understand and learn from. Thank you.
Sweta, I've got a quick question before we move on to the other speakers. You said you were betrayed by your leaders. Could you elaborate briefly on that? And also, why do you think, unlike other countries, it is harder for foreign countries to operate in whatever form in Afghanistan? Could you elaborate so that we can understand your point better?
Sure. So I think when President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, like basically when the Taliban took over Kabul on August 15th, that was the moral of the people went down, and it was such a difficult moment for everyone. And we really needed a leader who would be there to support us, to support us like morally, even if he cannot do like something else. And I think that is, and I'm sorry, like I'm being a bit emotional because it's such an emotional topic for me, and it's not been a long time since collapse, I would call it, of Afghanistan, and so that is how I feel like I see it as a betrayal. I would say personally, that's a personal opinion. In terms of the other question that you asked about.
Why is it difficult for foreigners to come to operate within Afghanistan?
It is very, very difficult. Like, for example, it is different. We have different culture. We are not like one nation and one voice. We have so many tribes in Afghanistan, and each of them have different histories, and there are many complexities within those tribes as well. Like, as you know, like we have different ethnic groups across Afghanistan, and even as a women's rights advocate, like for example, I would see a lot of NGOs and international organizations in Afghanistan working in Afghanistan, but they were not effective at all. Like most of them would just show the numbers, just to show the world that, okay, these international organizations are doing a great job, and they are training women and these things, but in reality, most of them, I'm not saying all of them, but like most of them, they were just showing numbers, and they were not effectively implemented because there's, again, very complex issues in regards to culture. So first, the culture, like it is hard to change a culture of a country. So first we need to understand that. And another thing is that it's very important to also, another lesson that now I kind of remembered is that we need to include Afghans. Like it is very important to include Afghans in everything. That is concerned. Yeah, that is concerned Afghanistan. Yeah. Because Afghans are from there, and they know the culture, the language, and like everything, the background. They can show better ways. Like, for example, there's no one-fits-all solution and strategy that can work in all the countries. So it will, like, something that will work in one country might not work for Afghanistan.
Right. Okay.
So I think, thank you.
Got it, Sveta. Thank you very much. Shanthie, could we go to you next?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
I think you raised very interesting and very important points, and it's good to have this timely discussion. And I think we need to demystify some of the myths on Afghanistan. One is what you mentioned is the graveyard of empires. Interestingly, if you look at the history of Afghanistan, it's always been a corner of the great past. And you've seen great games played out in Afghanistan right from the 19th century to the present day. So thereby, the countries intervening in Afghanistan don't actually understand the local history, the culture, the tribal dynamics, and the specificities of that country, which has been pointed out. And this is very important because for any country which is getting into another country, especially a foreign country, needs to understand the anthropology or the ethnography of that country. So therefore, if you look at the last 2 decades of international intervention, it has been more in terms of, or not really looking at the specifics to deal with stabilization of that country, and it had been on the very limited course. You did mention a lot in terms of the historical turning points, and if you look at the entire history of Afghanistan, most of these countries had their own agenda. It was not about peace and security in Afghanistan, right from the early 19th century to what happened in 1979 to 1989, the Mujahideen, the infighting, the civil war situation, the emergence of Taliban in 1996, and then ultimately the decimation of the Taliban in 2001. And if you look at the history from then on in the last 2 decades, it's very interesting that one is the US, which was the intervening part, didn't have a clear end state or an end vision in Afghanistan. Thereby, most of the strategies were shifting and very limited. The Bush administration in 2001 had a very limited counterterrorism goal. And the Bush administration was more interested in the war in Iraq, where Afghanistan would have been stabilized initially during the 2001 and 3, things started changing in Afghanistan. But importantly, the Taliban, which actually had a sanctuary in Pakistan, was not addressed. And Pakistan became an important ally in terms of the counterterrorism cooperation. And a lot of money kept channeling to that country in a way sustaining the insurgency. So from 2005 onwards, we did see a reemergence of Taliban, and this kept increasing. In addition to the shifting strategies in the US between counterterrorism to counterinsurgency during Obama administration, where actually President Obama in his halfback strategy talked about troop search for the counterinsurgency, but at the same time announced exit. So when you announce exit, you know that the Taliban knew that the Americans were there for a very limited point of time. And there was a popular joke in the Pashtun villages in southern Afghanistan. The Americans have the watches, but we have the time. So all they had to do was to wait on. And we also saw an interesting civil-military divide in the US, where Vice President Biden actually wanted withdrawal, and President Obama actually extended that playing out, in addition to the military strategy, which was not unified. So this added to the complexities. And if you see right from the time of President Bush to President Obama to Trump to President Biden, most of the withdrawal and calls for exit were based on American political calendars rather than on the needs of the Afghans on the ground. So I think on the security sector, there was huge gap in terms of actually having a clear vision and a unified mission. So the absence of a unified effort itself dissipated the amount of effort the Americans and the allies put in terms of current pressures in stabilizing Afghanistan. And we can talk about this in detail.
Yeah, I think we can talk about it a bit later, but that's a wonderful introduction. And so the key point I'm hearing from you, for example, with the US, is conflicting strategies. That's coming through. In fact, in just yesterday, right, there was the generals, the Joint Chiefs, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the Commander of the Central Command, they testified at the Senate hearing, and it's interesting that this conflicting strategies phenomenon that seems to be consistent, right? Maybe there's a good time for us to go to Micah, who's a captain with the U.S. Army and who served in Afghanistan. What are your thoughts, Micah, about what's been shared so far?
Yeah, I appreciate the previous two perspectives, and I'll say that anything that I say today is in my own personal capacity and not representative of the U.S. military or the DoD. But when I'm asked what can we learn or what has been learned over the past 20 years specifically, it kind of comes to me in threefold. And starting on a larger macro perspective and working down to the personal, I'd say the first thing from a strategic level is this impact of culture. And Sveto kind of gave a mention to it. Ray Dalio and both of them, two academics, and the head of Bridgewater from here in the United States, writes very heavily on culture, and he mentions that there's three things that drive a culture within an institution, and it's the external environment, the internal organizational dynamics, and the leader selection systems. And I thought it very interesting that Sveto talked on all three of these. From the external environment, a misunderstanding from a Western perspective of just how intricate Afghanistan is, not from a nation-state perspective, but from an individual tribal perspective. Those are lessons that we definitely could have learned in the 80s when we first went over there and funded covertly. And we seem to essentially miss the mark on that, as much as there was an effort and discussion and an effort to understand the tribal intricacies. Being able to truly communicate in individual ways to those tribes in order for them to work together is something that's almost impossible when you're an outsider. And it requires involvement with the local populace, which leads to the internal organizational dynamics, right? Like there was overlaying a Western construct of a government in a country that is not unified in tribes and has no history of that is very difficult to implement. And then finally is the leader selection systems. I was just as disappointed as Sveto was in watching the leaders of Afghanistan when they had a chance to really prove self-determination. They betrayed their people, and I would have to agree with her on that.
Is that your personal experience on the ground?
Oh, I was going to finish with that, but I'll bring that up now. I think that it's very, 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 and this is the biggest thing that I would stress, it's very important to separate the Afghan people from the government leaders who led them, the head of MOI, head of MOD, President Ghani. A lot of their leaders, it seems, based off of their actions, they were Western educated, they came back to Afghanistan, they gleaned money and they gleaned recognition, and then when the time came for them to be the leaders of the people, they didn't show up. And that is very sad, because the Afghan people themselves are some of the most incredible, persevering, brilliant individuals that I've ever worked with or ever met. And I'll give this personal anecdote. My two interpreters who I worked with on a daily basis for almost 10 months, they were two young men who left Afghanistan by foot when they were 14 and 15 years old respectively, and they walked from Afghanistan west all the way across Iraq, Iran, all the way eventually to France, and eventually making it to the UK where they received asylum. And then they came back to serve as interpreters, and they asked me one day, they said, Micah, why would you ever decide to join the Army knowing you were going to go to Afghanistan? And I gave some, I would say, probably politically correct answer about serving my country, whatnot, which is a different discussion. But what they said, but then I asked them, I said, why in the world would you ever come back here after you were able to build a place for your family to be safe? And he looked at me and he said, if you can volunteer to come help my people, the least I can do is come help you as well. And that just gave to me that, I learned more from him than I've learned from any academic institution or any classroom, knowing that, he put people and relationships above his own personal safety, because, the safety of his country and his people meant more to him than his own individual safety. And that meant a lot to me, and I think it gives an indicative understanding of just how amazing the Afghan people are.
So, a quick question, Micah. If that's the profile of the Afghan people, which seems to be quite accurate, because I've been hearing the same from others who've been on the ground, then why is it that that corrupt leaders emerge?
That's a really good question, and I think my thought process kind of stems from a breakdown between understanding that in order for a potential peace to rise, there has to be some type of security first, which, regardless of America's successes or failures, we've proven that what we can do is provide some type of security blanket. But what that feeds into, that I've seen, is essentially the spoils go to the biggest donor and the people who seek the most recognition. And I'm not sure if that's a condition, or that's a result of the human condition, that the natural people who rise to the top are the ones selfish enough trying to seek recognition, and those who are more selfless don't.
Right.
Or if it's a miscalculation in the way that we accept leaders. I'm not ignorant to the fact that we look at Vietnam and people have compared our departure from Afghanistan very much to Saigon, but you look at the influence that we put in putting Siem in power, which obviously led to no unification of Southern Vietnam. The same in Iran. With the same here, these are Western educated leaders, and I think that's obvious. That's not only a miscommunication, but also just a misunderstanding of exactly who needs to lead these governments, and the United States or any Western powers really taking a step back and understanding the secondary and tertiary decision or outcomes of leaders that we select to run these countries with our incentives.
And it goes back to the point that has been raised that foreigners who don't really understand can cause more harm, even with the intentions, where the intentions are good. I'd like to take this.
Can I add one?
Yes, please. Yeah.
I think that's a very nuanced discussion, right? What is harm, right? Over the past 20 years, we can't, the female literacy rate has improved to over 80%. The enrollment of women in education has improved drastically. The overall security for the past 20 years allowed for GDP to grow exponentially in a way that it hadn't before. For 20 years, did we provide more harm? Probably not in terms of factual number, but are we reaping the violent effects of that now? I would argue yes. So I think there's a nuance there as to what harm is brought.
It's a fair point. Micah. Thank you. Maybe it's a good time for me to check in on Aziza. Aziza, is there anything you'd like to raise as a co-moderator?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And maybe I would like to just reset the room with friends that joined into the space, and this is our IQ Inconvenient Conversation National room that we are hosting today, headed by Mr. Lead Moderator. We are speaking into understanding Afghanistan with an amazing panel guests and also with 3 youth international guests in the space as well. So I would love to, and I'm just really excited about what we are here in Mr. Viswa, because my heart's really knowing, not just understanding about it from what we learn and we hear, being from Singapore. There's so many other things that it's coming into light in our spirit. It's like lighting us up at a whole new place. And what Mr. Micah was saying as the final conversation about the 20 years, what was it? So much of conviction has come about it. I'm just waiting to see what else will come out of this as well. I want to hand my back to you.
Thank you.
Can I speak?
Yes, please, Chandran.
Okay, this is Chandran. I thought I was going to be ignored. Thank you so much. So I'm going to try and answer your first question, what have you learned? But before we say that, to Micah's point, what is harm? What is harm is 175,000 Afghans dead over 20 years. What is harm is a foreign Judeo-Christian army essentially invading a country, and its president literally saying on the day it invaded that we're going to turn them back to the Stone Age. That is harm. So let's just get that correct. So when we talk about history as well, let's be very correct. But quite often history is not my version. It's someone else's version, and quite often it's the Western version of history as well. That is essentially an industry in itself. So even your version of what you painted out as history, there are some certain things that could be debated. That the Taliban didn't want to hand over Osama bin Laden. Well, there are different versions of that. And for those who are interested, even The Economist, that sort of neoconservative publication this week, invited Noam Chomsky for the first time in many years to write on the cruelty of American imperialism. And he talked about that. And he talks about the fact that actually the truth is coming out over time. So when we talk about history too, our narratives are essentially embellished by what we know. Most of us in Asia, and unlike the three others, I haven't been to Afghanistan, but I've traveled around the world. I lived in Southern Africa during the Civil War, etc., during the anti-apartheid movement, etc. Most of us in Asia, particularly in developed places like Singapore, etc., we are subservient to a Western narrative. So we bought into their version of the world. And just 2 points I'd like to say about what we have learned. The first thing that we have learned is that the narrative is essentially still seen through the lens of a Western worldview, and language is important. We talked about the international community. Well, the international community did not support the invasion of Afghanistan nor Iraq. It was the Western world that supported it, and there too, just a minority. When we talk about the world doesn't understand it, actually a lot of the world does understand, because we've been subject to the same invasion and occupation. The Western world doesn't understand. So what have you learned primarily? We've learned that the Western narrative is dominant. And even in terms of describing this little conversation at the start, I noticed that one of the things in the blurbs advertising this session said that activists are apparently putting their lives on the line. Well, it depends who you call an activist. If an activist is someone you see who's not on the side of the Western narrative and the US and NATO occupiers of the land, then they are seen as you're on our side, you're good people. But if you're seen as someone who's essentially fighting an occupier, then you are essentially called Islamic fundamentalist, you're a terrorist, and my God, you must be a Taliban too. You're not called a freedom fighter. I saw this very well in my time in Southern Africa. So language is important, narrative. So what we have learned is Western narratives dominate. They've essentially permeated the discourse in all of these conversations among elites like us, because we did not call what is 175,000 deaths is essentially the harm. Second point I want to make is the West is incapable of learning. It's incapable. The Americans have essentially hell-bent on flexing their muscle throughout the world, and we all know this. So it's incapable of learning, and it's incapable of learning because it needs to preserve its historical privileges economically around the world. And today America is an emblem of the representation of Western power. Thus the Europeans follow, etc. The third point I will make is the idea that Judeo-Christian armies can invade other countries, particularly Muslim countries, etc., and then pretend to talk about culture is hubris. All over the world, we all know that civilizations and cultures are different. It's the same in Africa, etc. Afghanistan is unique in its own way, but so is Indonesia, so is Nigeria, so is Morocco. They're all different people, different tribes, etc. But Western intervention has not been prevented by this idea that they understand, because understanding is not part of the equation. Dominance is part of the equation. And the last point I'd like to make in terms of what we've learned is the US military today is a global threat. Let us be very clear. And let us not sort of hide behind fig leaves that they have brought liberation, freedom, and they're going to protect women, etc. This is not the truth, and we are intellectually dishonest by not understanding that fundamental truth. The industrial military complex is not a conspiracy theory of leftists, because I'm not a leftist, but it's essentially a reality of the military complex, and they seek wars. And the idea that they have left Afghanistan but don't seek wars is also naive at the utmost. So let me say that is what we have learned, and it's we is the world at large. The Western world keeps being in denial because it has to cover up this mirage of its apparently higher moral ground. So let me stop there.
Right. Thank you, Chandran. So essentially, I mean, you're talking about, you brought up some really important points about language, about the way we, the optics, the way we look at things, and very importantly, the narratives that emerge. Micah, would you like to respond?
Well, I'd like to expand on that before you allow Micah to respond, because one of the things I like to say on that is, why is every Afghan who is essentially fighting for their country a Taliban, who's then associated with essentially Islamic fundamentalists? If I was an Afghan male today, I would probably carry arms during those 20 years and fight the Americans.
Yeah.
Just
so
like the
I understand, Chandran. Yeah, I understand. I think you've made your point. You've made your point. Yeah, Chandran.
And I think that
yes,
Chandran,
Micah, please go ahead.
I think a lot of what you say, Chandran, is valid to think about. Specifically on the last point that you mentioned. When you understand the nuance, I like to say it like this to people who, in the West specifically, who haven't been over there or don't understand the Afghan situation. I start with it. If I was an Afghan male, I probably would give two thoughts to being part of the Taliban or being a freedom fighter in some sense, right? Here's an organization that was the only recognized government in the late 90s, early 2000s, that, keep in mind, whose predecessor was funded, yes, by the United States in order to push out Russian occupation. And then all of a sudden, 5-6 years later, the United States comes in and says, actually, no, you're not going to be in power anymore because you allowed a terrorist organization to be able to have a bed in your country. So then you spend 20 years where these people were the only recognized government, and they're just simply trying to have self-determination. So I understand your point. I think that also means that there's much more there's a nuanced understanding that should be required in being able to encompass all of not only the Taliban, but people seeking independence in Afghanistan. Not only within the Taliban, you also then have the Haqqani network who are further more extreme. And then you keep in mind, there's portions of the Taliban that fought with NATO forces against ISIS, right?
Yeah.
So
but Micah, I guess you agree that attaching labels is not productive, is not constructive after a certain point.
I agree with that. What I don't agree with is, and I would love to hear, because I don't think Chandran have a right to speak on this, as Sveto does. When it comes to harm and we talk about death on the ground, I would really be interested to hear her opinion on, we can't prove a negative, right? We can't prove how many deaths would have come or the suffering that would have happened to individuals on the ground if the Taliban had remained in control.
Right.
And what we can only see is what did happen. I would argue that, yes.
That is disingenuous.
No.
Chandran,
but Chandran, I think we should let Micah finish his point.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sure.
The United States and Western powers, on fundamentally, as a result of the military-industrial complex and the very natures of a capitalistic economy, seeks engagements due to the economic return of said engagement. I think that's something that we have to reconcile because it's fundamentally true. And from my experience, I've spent plenty of hours talking with my peers about the need for us, as the United States specifically, to pull back from our overreach with our military bases, with our military involvement, etc. I think that's also balanced with the fact that there needs to be, we have we cannot be an isolationist nation either, because I don't think that that's beneficial for anybody in that. But not being isolationist, the alternative is not specifically just having military presence, and that's what I think we fail to understand. We almost adopted the narrative that military comes first, and it's my personal opinion that military action should be the very last thing used after all diplomatic action.
Right.
And we've seen very evidently that that has not been the case, because most importantly, I would say in Southeast Asia, when we just randomly pull out of the TPP because we didn't want any type of diplomatic discussion, that definitely led to more tensions.
Right.
But I'll digress there.
Okay. Thank you, Micah. Sweta, I think it's important that we hear from you on what both Chandran has said and Micah have said, as well as the other speakers.
Thank you for the discussion. I agree. I would say I agree with Chandran with the points that he mentioned. So it's again personal opinion, but honestly speaking, if you speak to any Afghan in Afghanistan, so if you speak to any Afghan in Afghanistan, they are against like the foreign occupation, of course. Like that's very obvious because we have been like Afghanistan basically has become like a playground for foreign countries to come and invade, and we have, and who were the struggling at the end? The innocent people, the Afghans that I worked with, the Afghan women that I worked with on a daily basis, and like everyone, they are the ones that were suffering. And in 2019 alone, over 700 civilians were killed by the airstrikes, and even during the evacuation of the people, of the Americans and others from Afghanistan, it was very recently, like the airstrike. They did the airstrike, the U.S. military, and that killed 10 innocent people. And out of those 10 people, 7 people were from one family. And it was very heartbreaking to see what was happening there, and. So that's I feel like that will be the general opinion of Afghan people from what I see and know as an Afghan. But of course, we can't deny the positive changes that have been brought during the past 20 years. Like we cannot deny that. Yes, and we can talk about the future. Currently, I feel like there can be a lot of discussions about like who was wrong, who was right, what has been done in the past 20, 40 years, and what like doing talking about the failures and everything. But I think it's very important to talk about like the solutions now and like the strategies and like ways to like improve the current situation, because we know like currently we have the humanitarian crisis, we have like this urgent economic and employment crisis in Afghanistan. Almost all the people that I know in Afghanistan currently, they don't have jobs and they are leaving for other countries like Iran just to find a work and support the family. And it is very difficult, like economically, it is very heartbreaking when I speak to my family members and friends. They can't, like a lot of Afghans, they don't even have a bread to eat. So this is the situation currently that we need to raise awareness, to share with the world and to talk about it. And I think for me personally, the first one comes this hunger crisis that we're having right now in Afghanistan, and then comes other issues like women's rights, which I'm very passionate about and I'm working on that. But I think that will come next. The next thing that we have to raise awareness, and this is very uncertain time. And I feel like the international community needs to support Afghanistan currently and hold the Taliban accountable. And I think this can be a great strategy currently right now for the international community to make sure that they respect women's rights, and they put some conditions before helping them. So I think that's going to be one of the solutions.
Thank you. And so you're talking about basic rights first, basic needs. The right approach would be to look at basic needs first before you look at others. And
can I jump in on that, please?
Yes. Quick one, please.
Right, quick one. So, Sweta mentioned a very important point. Right now, we need to help the Afghan people.
Yes.
But, where were these people who were supposedly occupying the country and developing this country for 20 years? They leave in 3 weeks, and suddenly there's no food, and it's a fault of the Taliban. I mean, please, let us think about this.
No. I don't think.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yes. Famine, and the entire white world is outraged, apparently, because these Muslim fundamentalists are now starving the people. Sorry, that's not what happened.
No, I don't think anyone is saying. I don't think anyone is presenting it in such binary terms, Chandran, at this point in time.
I'm not presenting it in binary terms. Listen to the news every day. Let me just finish the last point, right? So that's apparently the famine is all the fault of the Taliban. They haven't been even given a chance. And I'm not saying I support the Taliban. I'm going to call that the government of Afghanistan. So the second point, who is imposing sanctions on them? The Western world. Right? The people who care about women, children, etc., have frozen the assets of this country. So if the current government in Afghanistan has blood on their hands, so is the damn West. So
right. Okay. All right.
Don't help them. But don't bias and try and harm them and say we're trying to help women and children. I'm happy to lead this conversation if no one's prepared to be honest.
All right.
Micah, can I ask a question?
Quick one, please.
Because I don't have an agenda drive. I'm genuinely here to learn. And so my question is, where is the balance, and both from Chandran and Sveto, where's the balance in where the international community should help? So specifically, when the withdrawal happened and planes were sent from not only the United States but from many other Western powers to essentially let anybody out who wanted out of Afghanistan, was that the right thing to do, or should we not have helped with that? And then more secondly, in terms of assets being made available to the Taliban as the government, how much is too much to where the Western is now imposing its own will? And secondly, if the Taliban is, I'm very intrigued about what you also comedians about the fact that the mayor of Kabul is still there running all of essentially the entire industrial side of the city of Kabul, because the Taliban has said that they're not capable of doing it and they're keeping him employed. Is that the right thing to do, even though he's Western educated? And where's the line between how much the West should help in terms of finances and or helping people get out of the country versus imposing their own?
Right. So Micah, I hear what you're saying. Here's my question, right? You are familiar with General McMaster, right? Lieutenant General. Now, you're familiar with the book he published in 1998, very well-known book called The Dereliction of Duty, right? Mm-hmm. It was an expose on who's responsible for the Vietnam War debacle, Presidents Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Defense Secretary McNamara, and so on. And now the question is, this question of this whole point about dereliction of duty that he talked about, General McMaster, in 1998, with respect to Vietnam, is history repeating itself now? Are we witnessing in any form a dereliction of duty in the case of U.S. in Afghanistan? I'm asking. It's an open-ended question. I'd like to hear your view, whether this applies, because my sense is McMaster in his interviews recently seems to suggest that there is some form of dereliction of duty in Afghanistan, because after all, about $2 trillion have the U.S. spent $2 trillion in the last 20 years. The question is, where did the money go?
Right, yeah, that's a good question. You read any of the CGAR reports, I think it's upwards of 30% of funding was known to go directly to corruption. That's not even accounting for the unknown. And that was reported for years and years and years, and nobody was held accountable for that. I 100% recognize that. I think that there's a balance between how much the NATO forces are held responsible for not implementing a system that was that could be upheld in a country, and then also recognizing, as this conversation started with, that you can't export a culture to another culture. And when the opportunity arose for the leaders of Afghanistan to have self-determination, they took a flight out of the country and left. And I don't think the correct answer is to blame blame the other party. What the correct answer is to, I can only speak for the United States and for myself and for the West. One, us recognizing that it is not beneficial for us nor anybody else to impose a culture on another country. Two, even with the best intentions, in an idealistic world where we are essentially doing everything right, it's not even beneficial to think about that, because that's not possible. Other personal incentives come in, national interests come into play, and it ends up falling down a very quick rabbit hole of people who have also not had a voice on the global stage. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, who have not had a say on the global stage, often get pushed aside. And the other thing I would say that we have to remember from a United States perspective is for every one person in the West, there's three not in the West. And I think Chandran mentioned this a little bit. And I think that is important to recognize, is that globally, we are the minority. And there are other people and other institutions who choose and would like to run their countries other way. And that doesn't mean, that's not binary in that if they want to run it differently from like democracy, that then they are anti-American or anti-West. It's just different. And I think that's important to recognize. And, I can't be responsible for changing somebody else's perspective. That's just the one that I take. And I think, that I try to carry in the position.
All right, point noted, Micah. I'd like to use this opportunity to go to our youth panelists.
Just before
Wasik?
the first one, can I just add on?
Yes, a quick one, yes.
Yes, reset of the room. And just before that, Michael, when you were talking about this, I just have this crazy thought. In this 20 years, whatever happened, what's happening right now could have happened 20 years ago, and they would have already fought it out and created a success for the country. But all things happen as it happened. And I love what Sveta was saying. How do we focus on the current solutions instead of playing this, blame game or labeling or whatever? And how can we take forth a more constructive and powerful, conscious decision for humanity, starting off with what's needed for the world right now? So I reset the room. I just want to tell everyone we are in a inconvenient conversation, international room, with Mr. Biswa lead moderating this conversation about understanding Afghanistan. This room is recorded. So if you're coming onto the stage to speak, we ask of you as you come onto the stage, if you are invited, please ensure your mic is muted, because the recording is done and will interfere with the recording and the voice coming out from the speakers as well. So thank you once again, and back to you, Mr. Biswa.
Thank you very much, Aziza. And I think you brought up a very important point. I would very much like to go with what Aziza said, to talk about the present and the future, what we can do instead of I think we have talked enough about the past, right? Now I'd like to go to our youth panelists. Abdul Wasik. Wasik, over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you. Speak a bit louder, please.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I would like to add some points on the questions. What we should learn from 4 decades in Afghanistan. The first thing that the international community and also the leaders in Afghanistan, they should do is that Afghanistan is the home of diverse communities. It is not a uni-tribal country. Like each tribe has its own history, rich history, culture, and language. These all should be respected in the international level and also in the national level. The second thing that the international community should understand is that a centralized political or administrative system is not responsive in Afghanistan because of the the diverse communities who live there, or because it is a multi-tribal country, and each of these tribes has the power to challenge a government, a central government. So, like a centralized political and administrative system can't be responsive in Afghanistan. And the experience of these 4 decades has shown
Why do you think so, Wasi? What's the reason why a central government system won't work in your view?
In the last 20 years, everything was in the hands of like the president. And the president is from one tribe in the last 20 years.
You're talking from Hamid Karzai onwards and Ghani.
Yeah, from Hamid Karzai and Ghani.
Yeah.
So this was highly centralized government, highly centralized administrative system, which all other tribes raised their voices in this 20 years that this system is not responsive. Why? The first thing is that in the last 20 years, these two leaders tried to impose their own culture and language on other minorities. This is not acceptable in Afghanistan. None of them consider their language, their culture, and their history to be removed in the country. So this was one of the main and critical things that the people did not stand with the government and they did not fight against Taliban.
Okay.
So this is one. Yeah.
Thank you, Wasi. Thank you. Those were very important points you raised. And I'd like to also ask if there's anyone else in the among our youth, Chayanika. Is there anything you'd like to raise?
Sure, thank you so much.
Louis?
Yeah.
Louis? Yeah. So Chayanika, go ahead.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Sadasivan, for the discussion, and it was quite an intriguing discussion, to be honest with you, and there's so many things to chew on and to talk about. And without really discussing the past as such, but I think it's quite essential for us to draw some lessons from history, which we seem to have forgotten right from the time the USSR had invaded Afghanistan. And I think the speakers, particularly the Afghan speakers, have talked about the diversity of Afghanistan, and which is a point that I kind of echo with. But the mismanagement of the current war, or the war that had happened in the past, wasn't so much a result of diversity in Afghanistan, because I also come from a country which is immensely diverse. But I think I kind of echo the sentiments of Mr. Chandran here as well, which is about the Western hubris, about how they kind of ignored these diversities, these fault lines, and imposed a particular way of governance in Afghanistan, which was highly centralized. And as I think Wasiq has already pointed out, most of the presidents, especially since the 1970s, or in fact even before that, in fact going back to the 1919 itself, except for a particular instance when we had when we had somebody ruling Afghanistan who was not a Pashtun. Almost everybody who has been in power in Afghanistan belongs to a particular community, and this highly centralized system was perhaps the reason why the government had collapsed, and it had to collapse in Afghanistan, as we had seen on the 15th of August. So that's point one. It was a mismanaged war, not because of the diversity of Afghanistan, but because of the American failure, or for that matter, the failure of the Western world to understand and appreciate it. And I think Dr. D'Souza had also pointed out that despite having ethnographers, despite having anthropologists on board on projects such as the provincial reconstruction team, it did not materialize, it did not really amount to much. I think I was reading a report previously on how the Americans did not even bother to learn the language of the country that they had invaded, and they stayed there for more than 20 years. So that's point one. And now basically coming to this stuff that we ought to do in order to not let Afghanistan become the Afghanistan of the 1990s is to make sure that we don't forget it. The humanitarian crisis is of extreme importance and of relevance in the present times, because we have more than 4 million people who are displaced within Afghanistan without a source of income, without anything on their table. So,
and this does not include the refugees, another 3.5 million.
Exactly, this does
not outside of Afghanistan.
Particularly so, and in fact it is very crucial for us to highlight the fact that the percentage of people, in fact, I think if I'm not mistaken, the UNHCR has calculated that about 35,000 people find themselves out of Afghanistan because of the current crisis. And while the Western world is crying about not wanting to take the refugees in, it is particularly countries around Afghanistan, where be it Iran, Pakistan, or Tajikistan, who have absorbed the maximum refugees.
Yeah.
So I think somewhere the Western world, and I think we can kind of gauge that from our Twitter feeds as well has started to ignore and forget Afghanistan, and that's something that we need to rectify immediately unless we want the narrative of the graveyard of empires to continue. It's essential for us to change the narrative to something that's more constructive, to something that is more productive, and stop treating Afghanistan as a graveyard of empire and probably focus on making it a land bridge as it had once been in the 19th or
So to a large extent, Janika, you're in agreement with Chandran Nair.
Viswa, can I jump in?
Yes, a quick one, please. Thank you.
I'm always told to be quick.
Yeah, I'm telling it. I'm saying this every
okay. All right. The point I want to make is on the way forward. And Ricardo asked, what's the fine line? The fine line is us to accept the West cannot lead this. It is complicit. So therefore, we need something that is truly international rather than the term international, which means the Western world. Why not? We in Asia lead this. The moment China is mentioned, it's seen as, oh my God. So the West will never allow anybody else to help Afghanistan because it needs to occupy that space. So a way forward is the world, which is a non-Western world, telling the West, you cannot impose sanctions. You need to release their money. We will go and help, not with military, but we will go and help sending scientists, engineers, whatever they need. That's the way forward. Singapore could lead this. Imagine a diplomatic corps set up by Singaporeans. We have better diplomats than the entire United States put together. We don't need generals. So, I'm telling you seriously, we need to think very differently. As long as we have the terms of reference of the West, we subservient Asians and Africans will never be able to find solution. They can't lead the solution. Please get it into your heads. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandran. Louis, could you give your perspective as a youth?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this event. I just wanted to point out the article by Anand Gopal called "The Other Afghan Woman," and in this article it describes there was a lot of talk about feminism and the way that women in Afghanistan got a lot more rights over the past 20 years. But so in his article, he points out that most of the rural population, which is 70% of Afghanistan, is actually looking forward to a return of what they hope is going to be stability. So that's just an interesting counterpoint about the past 20 years being productive for women in general.
Right. So you feel that the past 20 years has been productive for women in Afghanistan?
So
are you suggesting that it's because
there's been some evidence about that with the level of education and access to jobs, but they don't really talk about the rural population, which never saw this sort of improvement.
It never reached them. Yeah. Okay, Shanthie, I think this is a good time
Can I
to come
add
to you.
a point on that? Sorry.
Yes, please, Sveta. Yes.
I'm not sure how to pronounce his name.
Louis.
Okay, Louis. You mentioned a very great point, and so that's what I was very sad. Like when I see like NGOs and international organizations working in Afghanistan, most of their projects are focused in big cities like Kabul and Herat, and very few pay attention to the rural areas, which is, as you mentioned, like more has like more than 80% of Afghans live there, and so I completely agree with that report. And but there were to just mention Micah's point like earlier about, yes, we can't ignore the work, like some of the women's rights advocacy work that has been done in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. Like we have 27% of the MPs are women, and women own businesses, and they develop like in different spheres. Now that there's like a big question mark, there's a bit uncertainty about like that specifically, that issue around like because the Taliban announced that girls can go to school up to grade 6th, and after that they said we will announce it. So they told that they will announce later, once they have all the arrangements of like separating having the female teachers and the female in the women only schools. And also they another point that they mentioned is that they banned women from going to the Kabul University for teaching or studying, but again they mentioned that it will be like temporarily for now. But there are a few points actually that I would love to mention about the current situation in Afghanistan in terms of like the current regime, is that in general, when I speak to people on the ground, they are happy with the security situation. They say that the security is better because before we would lose like 100 people a day all across Afghanistan. Now so the Taliban are trying to eradicate criminality and corruption. And that is one of the things that is happening, and people in general are happy in terms of that because they can go outside without worrying being robbed or being facing a suicide attack or bombings. So that is something that I wanted to mention to give like a different perspective as well. And private universities are open, so women and girls are actually going to private universities. So currently the public universities are not open yet, but yeah, so we just need to, so going forward we need to find ways to hold them accountable, what they are saying, and just again raise awareness. I think that's one of the things that I would love to ask like non-Afghan audience and everyone here to raise awareness because that way we can change something, we can do something about the future rather than spending too much time on the past.
Yes. And I think that's precisely the reason.
Thank you for speaking the truth.
Yeah.
That's precisely the reason why, Sweta, that we're having this discussion, to gain from the perspectives. I think it's a good time for us to also go to Shanthie.
Yes, please. I've been waiting for some time, and there are a lot of inconvenient questions asked, and we're looking for some inconvenient answers as well.
I'm hoping for illuminating answer from you, Shanthie.
Yeah, definitely. But very quickly going through this debate of, we are trying to see Afghanistan through different prisms, and that's when I think there's a fundamental difference of understanding what's happening inside the country. And broadly, I did speak about the military and the security aspects, about the lack of unified mission, but that actually percolated even in terms of the economic aid which Afghanistan was receiving. So what you saw in Afghanistan was an experiment which the international community continued doing, but good effort to dump and walk away, which they have done now. And that's when we have led to a situation where we are facing a huge humanitarian crisis. Now, if you look at the issues inside Afghanistan, one is on corruption. You can blame the Afghans for many things. A lot of stereotypes that Afghans are corrupt, Afghans are not capable. But that's not really true, because the international community had been doing its projects on its own without actually giving money to the Afghans, to the Afghan budget. So you didn't have institutions in that country. So the crisis you saw in terms of the political collapse and the economic collapse is also a function of the way the international community gave aid to Afghanistan. So there was no accountability. There was a lot of money siphoned off, and thereby we saw the rural-urban divide which has played out. Rural areas which I visited, be it in Kandahar or around Nangarhar, absolutely no development. So these were areas which came under the Taliban influence. And what Sweta is saying today is, people are fed up with the fighting and the violence, and there was a war fatigue which developed. And thereby, there was some kind of sign that the Taliban were welcome. But now that leads us to this question, for how long? Because once the Taliban start imposing those strict laws and start restricting freedom, then there will be opposition developing inside Afghanistan, which we see. The second is to understand in terms of what it means to stabilize Afghanistan, and I think that's the fundamental difference which is coming out from the US and from the region. It looks like US is an occupying force, a foreign force which doesn't understand cultures and has gone there to achieve its objective. Most of it could be true, but in this intervention, there have been certain positive developments in the last 2 decades. Particularly in terms of women's rights, particularly in indicators of girls going to school and all of that. And losing that would be a huge loss to the international community. So if we are going to engage
losing what? Sorry? Losing
that
what?
will be a huge loss for the international community.
What will be a huge loss?
losing the gains made in terms of women's rights, the girl's child, and the development indicators which you saw in Afghanistan, which was fragile, but still happened. It's not that everything was squandered in Afghanistan or US was just there for a very limited goal. There were certain positive indicators, and that's the concern of losing those gains. So even if today you're looking at engaging or recognizing the Taliban, would you go back to recognizing a regime which is under the UN sanction list with linkages to international terrorist groups and no conditionalities put on them on how they behave? And more importantly, about the acceptability inside Afghanistan. If you remember, Vice President Amrullah Saleh took up the flag of resistance in Panjshir, and Panjshir was bombed while the rest of the world watched. So if you're talking about self-determination and self-preservation, I think we have to ask this inconvenient question, that a government, which was caretaker, vice president, had put up resistance. So is a capture, total capture of power by an organization which is a terrorist group, acceptable to one, international community, and more importantly to the Afghans? And that is an inconvenient question we're asking, and it is an inconvenient answer. But having said that, how do we actually engage the Taliban in bringing about change in their behavior? Could we look at any kind of an inclusive government or any kind of moderation of behavior in Taliban, that they abide by the international laws of governance and deliver to the people what they haven't got? Now, you can blame the political leadership before, and I agree with most of it, because I've done election observation in Afghanistan and I've seen how elections are held and how they have actually delegitimized the government. And more importantly, even if you look at the peace process which the US initiated, actually tied the hands of the Afghan government. To just blame the Afghan political leadership is not enough. I think everyone had a role, and thereby what happened from February 29, 2020 to August 15, 2021 was eventual. There was a writing on the wall that things are going to go this way. So was the international community prepared to deal with this eventuality, or all of us were just caught in a surprise because we wanted to be caught in such a situation? But at the end of it, what we are looking at is Afghanistan, where thousands have been displaced, thousands have become refugees, and thousands more women are risking their lives fighting for their rights. And if we don't have a concerted international campaign for Afghanistan, I think Afghanistan will be forgotten once again. And more importantly, it could go back to 1990s, from where such kind of attacks emanated and affected the world. I think that's it.
Wonderful, Shanthie. The thing here is, international action, coordinated, consolidated international action that is not military in nature, I believe. That's what you're referring to, right?
Yes, absolutely. And
not military in nature.
Not military in nature at all, because I don't think military effort has yielded in results, but not in terms of long-term stabilization, particularly in the political sector and the economic sector. Because both are very essential. Afghanistan transport trade has increased, and we are looking at a real vacuum in that region, and that's dangerous.
Right. So, you see, my concern, and this has been expressed by others as well, is the regenerative capacity. A few people, commentators, have described this of the Taliban having regenerative capacity. Now, what shocked me personally was in the hasty pullout of the U.S. forces. The whole process seems to have aided Taliban. For example, the US left behind billions of dollars worth of military hardware. I'm told 208 airplanes and helicopters, 75,000 vehicles, military vehicles, and over 600,000 rifles, machine guns, and howitzers. All of this was left behind.
So I want to state facts here. I just want to state some facts.
All right.
So having been personally part of it. No, first I want to preface in that, Shanthie, I agree with 95% of stuff that you said. I just had one more question. But I mean, as somebody who's part of that military arm, I agree that military is the last answer that we need. But so to your point, we spent a year dispositioning and taking care of equipment that had not been provided to the ANA. The equipment that was left was equipment that had been given to the ANA in order for them to be able to fight. that was given the ANA owned that equipment, and it was given to them for them to be able to operate. When the ANA withdrew,
you mean the equipment that I just referred to, the airplanes, helicopters?
Correct.
Okay.
That was stuff that was under the jurisdiction of the ANA. Was it originally U.S. military equipment? Yes. Was the equipment that they were given in order for them to be able to become independent and fight their own engagements? Yes. Now, I'm not making a quality statement on that of the right or wrong, just the objective fact that that was equipment that had been dispositioned to the ANA.
Right. Yeah, and I take your point, but my concern right now is this is left behind.
But can I make a point?
No, not yet, please. This is left behind, and this is being used. This is likely to be used by two groups of people. One, the Taliban, to strengthen their military position, and my greater concern, the greater concern that people have, is that this could be sold or given away to other terrorist organizations. We know that ISIS is already operating there. We know that Al Qaeda has got a presence there. I don't know which other groups are going to be there, and this is the concern that we have. Now, all of this is going to create mayhem, and which means that there's going to be less energy and resources given to helping people improve their lives and their livelihoods. This is the concern, right? Yes. So, Chandran, you had a point.
Yeah, can I just quickly, just a couple of points? Yeah, all the points you make are valid in the context of the current narrative. That there are even it was said, the terrorists are running the country. Let's be very clear about this too. I'm no supporter of either side in this, but freedom fighters everywhere in the world in the history of the program of liberation have been called terrorists. The Palestinians are called terrorists, right? So before we call all the people who have banded together to essentially chase the occupiers away, Taliban and terrorists, let's understand that they would not be where they are without support. Do they have to reform certain things? Absolutely right. We have to go and help, but this cannot be led by the West. The point I'm trying to say is, we always forget that the so-called terrorists are a response to state terror. The United States and its allies have inflicted state terror on these countries, and therefore what you have, an asymmetric war. An asymmetric war where the powers with all the jets and the bombs essentially call the others the terrorists. This is the falsity of the discussion. Now we have to say, we are not holier than thou. We're going to help. And the way we're going to help is not putting demands on the table, but actually being strategic and saying, firstly, hey, how can we feed everybody in this country? Can we help you? Can we come? We're not going to pretend that we are better than you. We're going to be humble. We're going to do it because it's a strategic goal. My point is the West is incapable of this narrative because it views itself as superior to everybody else. And its moral authority in the world depends on this outlandish suggestion that they know better than everybody else. But let's not forget, the terrorists that you call terrorists is somebody else's freedom fighter, and they're created by state terror too. And it's organized.
Okay, take your point. Wasiq?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, you have to speak up, Wasiq.
Yeah. For the points Chandran made, the first thing is that we cannot. This is wrong to say that Taliban are freedom fighters in Afghanistan. What is the definition for freedom fighter? Please show me one of the leaders that have been people in Afghanistan for the last 20 years or 30 years. All of them are the proxy forces of ISI, Pakistan ISI, because all of them are educated in Haqqaniya madrasas in Pakistan and also other madrasas in Pakistan. We cannot name them as freedom fighters for Afghanistan. They fought for other. Currently, you cannot see how the Prime Minister of Pakistan and the Foreign Minister of Pakistan are lobbying for them in the United Nations, in the international community, who they are, why they are pushing them, why they are pushing the international community to recognize them and give them legitimacy with whatever fully armed for now. They have taken all the weapons and everything left in Afghanistan. Currently, they are creating suicidal groups in Afghanistan. In each province, a suicidal group of 200 people. If you count these 34 provinces with 200 suicidal groups, what will be the number? What in the nearest future? In the nearest future, if they release this suicidal group in the neighboring countries, like mostly their target is the Central Asian countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. These 4 or 5 countries, their next target is these countries with these suicidal groups. So this will be a high danger and high threat to the Central Asia and also to Iran. So we should not name them as freedom fighters. I am from Afghanistan. I know who they are. I am not like talking for any other group or being directly against Taliban, but this is the reality. We should not forget this.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
This one I would like to button as well, if it's possible.
Yes, a quick one, please. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, I completely. So, you'd asked me if I see eye to eye with Mr. Chandran. Perhaps not entirely, because I cannot be as pithy as he is. And I agree with what Vasik has said. Taliban is not Afghanistan. And the whole Taliban is a particular phenomenon which traces its roots back to a particular country, which is not Afghanistan at all. And it is quite essential for us to distinguish between a freedom fighter who is perhaps known as a mujahid and a Taliban fighter who have different ideologies, who work according to different structural mechanisms. That is one. With that said, I kind of agree with the points that have been made by everybody here, that what we require is a genuine humanitarian international effort, which is not necessarily led by the West, but is led by each and every country, which kind of responds to the humanitarian crisis which is currently unfolding in Afghanistan, and at the same time hold the Taliban accountable. So if they've claimed for themselves an interim regime, if they've claimed that they would be an interim government for a particular period of time, I think it is incumbent upon each and every one of us to make sure that the Taliban as a phenomenon which is currently in power in Afghanistan remains brief and temporary.
And even while it's brief, more accountable.
It is extremely essential for us because Taliban is a political reality that we cannot wish away, and that's exactly what the US was trying to do for a good number of years, but they weren't able to do that, or because of a variety of reasons which I think have been touched upon by Dr. D'Souza, by Chandran sir, and as well as by Micah and Sveto as well. So we need to take all of those things into account to make sure that we do not forget the past and we do not forget the present, which we seem to be forgetting at this point of time. Afghanistan needs international humanitarian assistance more than anything else.
All right, got it. Thank you. Thank you, Shanika.
Can I make 10-second clarification?
Hold on. Okay, yes, go ahead.
I'm not supporting terrorism. I agree with my brother from Afghanistan who knows it better. I was just saying be careful who we call terrorists, because the history of the world is those who fought for freedom are often called. As for on the ground with the Taliban extremists, he knows better. I'm just cautioning that the geopolitics allows people to be labeled so easily. Look what's happened at Palestine.
And I think that's a great point, and it is we should all avoid broad brush sweeps. I'd like to go to a member of the audience who has been wanting to ask a question or make a comment. In your Lua Ogunse, I don't know whether I pronounced your name correctly. Apologies. Please speak up. In your Lua.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Speak up. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I quite been following this conversation, which has been very, very intriguing and sensational. It's very, very thought-provoking.
Where are you from, please?
To everybody. I am from Nigeria.
Okay.
I'm from Nigeria, Southwest Nigeria.
Okay.
Faculty member at Kautilya University. Now, the issue of Afghanistan is such a surprise to the world and the conduct of international relations and foreign policy. Actually, there is this view, this constructivist view of international relations, where the culture, the belief system, the geography, the landscape, and the existing structure, the language of the country, particularly Afghanistan, has to be held, has to be imbibed, has to be dealt with, has to be related with. You cannot ignore that. intervention must go with nation building. You can't give help to somebody you are not ready to actually know something about. That's my take. So the belief system is so important, as well as the culture. You have to engage with them and make them see themselves playing the role, and then they, the Americans, NATO allies, and giving a support, kind of, not actually enforcing it on them. It will not work. And so look at what Qatar has been doing. Qatar negotiated how to bring about the safe passage of people. And this is the pointer to the fact that the neighbors have a role to play in Afghanistan today. And everyone is a multilateral network that will actually make Afghanistan what it should be. Accountability for women's rights and all those things should not be lost. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. That's a great point. And actually, I'd like to put this question to Sweta in particular, but anyone else can respond as well. Sweta, my question to you is this. We are coming to the end. I'd like to extend the discussion by another 10-15 minutes because there are quite a few people who want to talk. Sweta, my question is this. Taliban recently have highlighted, have declared, obviously they are in some kind of a public relations campaign where they are trying to gain international acceptance. They're saying that they will allow girls to go to school, they will allow greater freedoms for women to participate in government and so on, as long as it's in keeping with Islamic guidelines. They've said that. And in a recent televised interview with Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, CNN's anchor, Becky Anderson, asked about the plight of women under Taliban rule, which we all know is known for misogyny and violence against women. The Prime Minister, Imran Khan, said that, and I quote him, he said, the solution lies in incentivizing the Taliban regime. I mean, that sounds quite strong, a statement, to incentivize the Taliban movement or regime that is known for misogyny and violence. But really, what he's saying is, if you don't, you have to accept the reality that Taliban is there, whether it's for a few months or a year or so, they're going to be there. And we need to find a way to incentivize them so that they will be able to do more good than harm to the people of Afghanistan. Now, what kind of incentives do you think the Taliban will respond to in adopting a less draconian, more humane style of governance, especially with respect to women? Sweta.
Yes, thank you. So as I mentioned previously, this is a very uncertain time. In general, those women and girls who are working and studying, now they are sitting at home, most of them, and how I would describe their feeling is they have fear and anxiety, and so because they never saw the Taliban and they never interacted with them, and they heard the experiences of the Taliban from their mothers and grandmothers about their regime during 1996, and based on the interview with the Taliban spokesperson, he said some things that could happen, and we need to hold them accountable. And so that was when they first came to Kabul. But now, as they are passing, we are seeing their rules and laws. Like girls from the secondary school are not allowed to go to school, and teachers and students cannot go to Kabul University, which is one of the biggest universities in Afghanistan, and there are no women allowed in the leadership positions in the government. And of course, they also don't have any women in their own leadership when they introduce themselves. So as an Afghan woman, myself, like, I don't want the young girls to be educated up to 7th grade only, or not attend a university at all. Education is very important, and it has always been for me, and I think for the
ambitious Afghan youth. And what I usually talk in my talks and say is about the ambition and the talent and bravery and strength of the Afghan women and youth in general, because now the Afghans are educated. They know their rights. They know their rights in Islam. They have the education and know about the true Islam. And this is the point that I want to mention, is that there is so much. This group of people, they misunderstand Islam. Islam encourages women to educate themselves, to go. It allows them to be entrepreneurs, to get education, and to go to work. This is encouraged. So I feel like one of the solutions, again, what I have in mind is that all Islamic scholars need to say how women could have a standing place in the Afghan society, and there needs to be constructive campaigns and discussions with these leaders, religious figures, to ensure that women are not discriminated against especially when it comes to education and economic opportunity. Because I feel like this is the fear of every Afghan girl right now in Afghanistan. And
I understand that, Sweta, I understand that, and I'm sure all of us here agree with that. But the reality we are facing is that the Taliban are in control of Afghanistan at this point in time. And the question is, what is it that can be done to move the needle? What is it that can be done to get them to think differently along the lines of what you said? Because on their own volition, they're not going to do it. So what is it that they can do?
I think, so as I mentioned previously, like the Islam encourages, and it is... we have our rights. We have our rights in Islam, and these things need to be. There needs to be discussions with them, with the Taliban, not us, but like religious figures. I think that is one of the ways.
Religious figures from Afghanistan, or religious figures from the region.
All around the world. From the world. It can be, yeah.
I think you want to add something? Yeah, can I just say?
Yes,
I
please.
think Sveto just gave you a very good look at, first, we need to solve the problem of people going hungry and all of that. The women's issue is very important, but you're not going to change it overnight. So just focusing on that and saying what we're going to do, well, it ain't going to happen in 3 weeks or in 3 months. But her suggestion is to engage the international community, Islamic scholars around the world, bring them together. That cannot be led by NATO and Europeans. Right? So we in Asia, other parts of the world, Africa, we live with Islam. We know the good things about Islam. And we negotiate them slowly. We don't carry a moral flag and say, you guys are bad, you got blood on your hands, you're terrible. And she pointed out, negotiate, take time. But you're not going to get results in two months. Yeah. That's what we need to do. And we bring Islamic nations to go and convince them. But meanwhile, we suck up some of what we see as not palatable. Clearly not. But what do you want? War, bombs, and starvation and sanctions? No.
Yeah, certainly not sanctions. Yes, and I'd like to. Who is this?
Can I say something?
Micah? Yeah. Go ahead.
So, Chandran, like I would be the first to agree with that, and that it is not. Not only is it not. It's not only it's not appetizing by anybody in the Middle East to have a Western, rather Protestant, Judeo-Christian perspective try to tell a Muslim country what to do. I 100% agree. And to drive the conversation a little bit further, I'd really like your perspective on this, because I think, and you mentioned that you've led to it in your writings, and you mentioned it previously a little bit before, and I think I would agree, and I would say that of the international community in Asia, the country that's best positioned both politically and economically to influence or hold the Taliban somewhat accountable to make sure that they're not overstepping their moral rights, I would say is China, not only in the fact they share a border. However, and obviously with their economic interests in Afghanistan. However, I would love to hear your perspective on, why would China be inclined to meddle in any good way with an Islamic country when we've seen what they've done in Western China to Muslim Chinese residents and what they've done in Xinjiang? And how would you say that there could be a balance between them ensuring some type of stability in Afghanistan, either through, giving money economically or providing some type of security blanket, and at the same time, not trouncing Muslims in that country because of what they've done in Xinjiang?
Yeah, Micah, the thing is, you made a point. But I wouldn't want the discussion now to go back into specific countries and go back into...
But the question that you asked earlier was, what can we do? And I think the reality of the situation is that China's position...
Yeah, I hear your point. But what I'm saying, we are coming to the conclusion. I'd like the discussion to talk a little bit more about international support, different countries coming together, not specific countries, if you don't mind. I understand your point. That China probably would want to play a more significant role. But I wouldn't want us to end this discussion along those lines. But I'd like to pick up from where Sweta left off, which is about the Muslim countries, the Muslim scholars from around the world coming together to talk about Islam and the kind of Islam that the Taliban could consider having and so on. Now, I'd like to have a quite quick view from Waseek as an Afghan yourself. What's your response to that? Please speak up, Waseek.
First, to the point they made that I am not against humanitarian aid in Afghanistan, but I am against recognizing or giving legitimacy to this interim government this soon. Negotiations should be there. Community they have the opportunity to negotiate. In the meantime, they can continue with their humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. The points I made is it doesn't mean that I am against humanitarian aid in Afghanistan, that I want war in Afghanistan. I am saying that if with what currently Taliban have in their hands, if the international community give them legitimacy, another war will start. There are people waiting for international community decision. What they will do.
I understand where you're coming from, Waseek, but I think we can't run away from some form of constructive engagement with whoever is in power at this point in time. For the sake of the people. We are coming to the end of this discussion. I'd like to go back to Shanthie. What's your view about the suggestion of international humanitarian aid as well as the Islamic scholars from around the world coming together and weighing in on the Taliban or the current government?
I think both are very important points, but one note of caution is when you're looking at Taliban today, it is not a Deoband organization. It has linkages with Al-Qaeda, which is Salafi Wahhabi form of Islam. So thereby, there is we are looking at the Wahhabi form of Islam, which is quite extreme. In addition to that, there is the Islamic State presence as well. And thereby, it is quite complicated in terms of the jihadi model in Afghanistan. But having said that, I think there is huge scope, especially from Deoband in India, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and other moderate countries coming together to bring some kind of pressure on Taliban to accept this moderate Islam rather than adopting this extremist form. And I think there is a considerable scope here, both inside Afghanistan, particularly with the religious scholars, which Sweta mentioned, but also in the region. And I think the Middle Eastern countries are looking at this option, and I think that would be a useful alternative to the extreme form of Islam this Taliban is propagating at this point of time. And in terms of humanitarian assistance, I think we will be engaged in this debate of whether we should recognize the Taliban or we should engage the Taliban. I think we need to engage, and recognition should come with some caution, because unless we deliver on the ground, I don't think the international community should rush to recognize them. So whatever assistance is being given by international organizations, particularly the UN, has to reach the people, and that kind of delivery is essential at this point of time. Secondly is about these people who are trying to flee this country in very desperate situations. I think we need to work on that refugee situation to see that this thing stabilize, particularly when countries have closed the borders, especially Pakistan border. Things have been very problematic for the Afghans. So I think we have to work with the UN and its agencies to see that the Taliban behave in a particular manner wherein we can address the questions in the near term. And in the near to medium term, then we could look at issues of governance, which is again very essential, because if you don't look at this interim arrangement, which is required, and moderation, which is required, I think we'll be going back to the 1990s, wherein you'll have a totalitarian regime with linkages with international terrorist organizations, which would be dangerous just not to Afghanistan and the region, but to the world.
Now, when you say 1990s, you're talking about the 5 years of Taliban rule. Hello? You're breaking up, Shanthie.
We're looking at a situation where
we can't hear you. Yeah.
I'm sorry, okay, the signal is bad. Anyway, just about lessons learned from history, I think Afghanistan is one case in point where we might see a repeat of history, so we need to prevent that.
Right. Okay, on that note, I'd like to ask each key panelist to, in one sentence, what is your final thought you want to leave us behind with? Can we go to Chandran?
Well, my
final thought that you'd love to leave all of us with.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Chandran.
Yeah, my final thought is, what was mentioned by Rika as well, that we need to essentially help the Afghan people. We have to work with those who are in control now, call them whatever you want. We have to not demonize them. And I agree with Imran Khan when he says incentivize, meaning work with them and bring them along, because we have no option. And that international community, including international, and not led by Western nations. So bring the regional powers, as mentioned earlier, bring Islamic scholars, and build the roads, build the schools, build everything. And as we mentioned before, the data is very clear. Most of that trillions of dollars never reach people. Reach them, and things will change. And it's a different view, and maybe it's led by nations, etc. That's my view. Work with what you have, but don't preach as though you're holier than thou. Thank you.
Thank you. You're there? You're muted. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Could we go to Micah? Thank you very much, Chandran. Could we go to Micah, please?
Yes, the only thing that I will say in conclusion is that, a friend of mine pointed out that often desperation and hope are on a spectrum. And it's true that people take, in extreme times of desperation, they take action that many would call violent or terrorist in nature, etc. But in many times, it's just an act in desperation to be able to work towards some type of hope. And as the international community comes around and looks for ways in which to help Afghanistan, I think the key thing is not to ensure that certain countries get recognition or that certain countries get something out of it, but how are we helping move that spectrum from desperation of hunger and not a stable government, etc., and pushing that in the direction of hope, not only from a governmental level, but down to the individual, both in the rural and the urban areas of Afghanistan, and help them to be able to come to a place where, hope and safety and peace is something that's recognized on a daily basis, not a life that's out of desperation.
Right. Thank you very much, Micah. Sweta, last word?
Yes. So I would like to finish this with a message of hope. I think it's very important right now to give hope to the Afghan people. So if you have friends, families, anyone that you know who is Afghan, it's just reaching out to them or speaking with them, because there's a lot of things going on, and people are processing a lot of things right now. And being an Afghan makes it even 100 times harder. And another thing is that we can't stay silent, so we need to raise awareness, especially around the women's rights issues. We need men, religious scholars, and international actors to become better allies to Afghan women, and because their voices will influence those in power. Thank you.
And we need those voices to continue to speak and speak up. Yeah. I'd like to now ask my co-moderator, Aziza, to say a few words in conclusion. Aziza, if you want to say your own personal thoughts, But let's keep it short because we are overrunning. Yes.
Absolutely. You know, when you talk about the Islamic scholars coming together, coming from an Islamic scholar family from Singapore, I'm like just thinking through what would be the thoughts among my family members as well. So that being said, I just love the next generation, the future of how we can come together in human spirit. I just have to shout out to Ms. Murshida in the room right now. You know, she's in the followers by. She has been running, supporting refugees from Afghanistan in Malaysia. And she gets ground level, and maybe in future we can bring in people who are supporting outside of the country, just like what Sweta has done and many others. Mr. Wiswa, I think this room is not done. We should have part 2 of resolutions only conversation, and that's where we need to hit, especially the kind of financial impact, physical impact, emotional impact it's having on internationally, you know, everybody else in the world, and how we can support as a whole for people in Afghan as well as those who are coming up in that space. And that's it. Mr. Wiswa, thank you so much for the wonderful space and everyone coming together.
Thank you very much, Aziza. It leaves me now, on behalf of my co-moderator Aziza, who just spoke, to thank my 4 panel speakers. I'm sorry that we couldn't give you more time. Shanthie, Chandran, Sweta, Micah, as well as a big thank you to our youth speakers, you know, Wasik, Chayanika, and of course Louis. My special thanks to all of you in the audience for making time to join us. There are just so many lessons to be learned from the recent history of Afghanistan and very well articulated thoughts today. Unfortunately, we aren't talking about a war gaming exercise here. I mean, real lives are at stake, especially of women, of girls. The rest of the world, like us, are unfortunately just relegated to becoming spectators. Yes, programs like this do help create awareness, but there's an urgent need for action, real action, certainly not military action again. What is needed is clearly, from the discussion today, not unilateral action by powerful countries with vested interests that will perpetuate the cycle of short-term interests. What we need would be a well-thought-out, coordinated action by key international bodies such as the UN, such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. Even though Afghanistan is not part of the Middle East, you know, influential Islamic countries should weigh in from all over the world, as has been suggested, on the Taliban leadership. Now, it's not so much about recognizing, but constructive engagement. Now, if we fail to constructively and firmly engage the Taliban leadership, there's every chance that we will push them deeper into the dark side. It will become a haven for terrorist organizations. As for the rights and welfare of women and girls that Sweta has been talking about, that Wasif have been talking about, it will certainly be a lost cause. Perhaps Prime Minister Imran Khan is right after all. We need to find a way to incentivize the Taliban to do the right thing, not do it for them. This is what Singapore's founding Prime Minister, the late Lee Kuan Yew, said to an interviewer, American interviewer, Charlie Rose, in 2008 on US and Afghanistan. And I quote him. He said, "To remake societies is beyond the capacity of any nation. It is indeed the right of the nation that owns it." This was Inconvenient Questions, where ideas awaken.